We'll even start.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to your nation's capital. Welcome to the United States House of Representatives, and welcome to the Subcommittee on Early Learning, Elementary and Secondary Education. This meeting is called to order. I'm Aaron Bean. I'm from Florida. I'm going to be your guide, your chair, your host as we embark on a journey to see what happened during COVID. What happened? We made a lot of decisions affecting our kids and schools. So today, we've assembled an all-star panel to help us see what happened and review what happened. I note a quorum is present, and without objection, the chair is authorized to call a recess at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony about the learning loss that resulted from pandemic school closures. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Do you guys remember the 90s? It was a decade of new and innovative technology. Grunge was the fashion and the live music. On the radio was Nirvana, Green Day, Alanis Morissette. Titanic and Forrest Gump ruled the big screen, and Seinfeld and Cheers dominated TV. School computers labs were filled with Apple Macintoshes, and if you were lucky, they were brightly colored iMacs with cutting-edge CD-ROMs where you could use your school's lightning-fast dial-up internet to check your AOL mail or spend countless hours playing Oregon Trail during class. And you felt like a fashion icon as you walked down the school's hallway wearing your Reebok pump sneakers on your feet, Trapper Keeper in hand, and Discman headphones around your neck. Great decade, but sadly, our American education system today is stuck back in that decade, the 90s. In other words, in only a matter of 2 years, a generation of progress was lost. The great irony of COVID is how a majority of parents who so easily predicted online education and school closures would be detrimental for students, and how so many bureaucratic education experts with all the research power in the world took years to reach the same conclusion. The nation's report card 2022 assessment for 8th graders found math scores are at their lowest point in 2 decades. The same for reading, history, and civic scores plummeted to their lowest mark since the tests were first administered in the 1990s. When you examine the data by class, you see an even more harrowing picture. Low-income and minority students suffered the most, and for some students from working-class families, school closures didn't mean online class. It meant babysitting their siblings, or in some instances, no school at all. Test scores are just a scratch of the surface of this learning loss. Undersea is a sea of social problems this generation is facing and will continue to face as consequences of school closures unfold. Adolescent mental health issues spiked, hospitals visits spiked, and sadly, so did suicides in certain regions of the country. It's a steep price to pay, and they're continuing to pay for these needless school closures, and I should say prolonged school closures. The mass shutterings of school throughout the pandemic is one of our greatest education policy failures in our nation history. At the height of the pandemic, school closures affected 97% of K through 12 students, over 55 million students. And as late as May 2021, well over a year after pandemic, school districts like in states in California and others were not back to in-person instructions. In my state, the free state of Florida, our schools were back in person within 6 months, and the data will show putting kids in the classroom sooner than later was the right answer. And examining who closed and when they closed, research shows teacher unions disproportionately affected school closures. A Brookings Institute study found that school districts with lengthier collective bargaining agreements were less likely to start the fall 2020 semester with in-person instruction. What the data does not support is that shutdowns were predicated primarily on pandemic severity. Let's not forget about the money. We are coming off the largest investment in education during COVID, over $190 billion during the COVID pandemic. What happened to that $190 billion? That may be a great question for our panelists. Despite what some people may say, money may not be the answer anymore. For those that think money is needed, we already tried that, and here we are. This whole thing was like a jagged little pill. This set of facts suggests that we need to rethink our pandemic responses. One was to rise again and how to recover. Where do we go from here? We've got some panelists that are going to help us chart that course. We start today by how it unfolded. Who knew what? When did they know? And then let's hold those that made decisions when the data reflected otherwise accountable. George Orwell famously wrote in his novel 1984 that the party's final and most essential command was to ignore the evidence of their ears and eyes. Parents and the American people, we're not going to be deceived. We must demand accountability for those responsible. We must decentralize the decision-making power for education in this country, and above all, that means school choice. At the end of the day, no solution will better equip American schools for another pandemic than empowering parents to make the best decisions for their children. Let's acknowledge some states made different decisions and let the data reflect where they are and where those students are going forward. We'll hear from who fared better than others from our witnesses. I want to thank everybody for coming here. We're going to have a robust discussion, and I look forward to everyone's testimony. With that, I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair Bean. And thank you to our witnesses for being with us to discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic negatively affected students and how we can help them recover equitably and effectively. I want to highlight that we're 6 months into this Congress, and this is our first hearing dedicated to missed learning time. My Republican colleagues claim they want to address this issue and help students get back on track, yet so far their legislative priorities have focused on culture wars and defunding public schools, including a bill they passed last week that would threaten critical resources for schools that provide shelter for migrants in need. But today, I hope my colleagues can put politics aside so we can have a productive, as the chairman said, and robust conversation and move in the right direction on behalf of students. In 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, school districts were forced to close classrooms to mitigate the spread of the virus and to protect students and staff and their families. School leaders did not take this decision lightly. Parents and teachers knew that remote learning could hinder students' learning, especially in the absence of digital equity. But they were also rightly concerned for the health and safety of students and staff and their families, especially because of the lack of testing, tracing, personal protective equipment, and vaccines at the outset of the pandemic. It was an extremely challenging and stressful time, as we all remember. We didn't know how bad the pandemic would be or how long it would last. Unfortunately, the Trump administration made things worse by politicizing the crisis and failing to act quickly to implement a science-driven response to COVID-19. Remember, it will be over by Easter. It is important to keep in mind that schools entered the crisis with a $23 billion racial funding gap that already existed between school districts serving mostly students of color and school districts serving mostly white students. And now numerous studies and national assessment results are showing the inevitable. Missed learning time hurt student performance, and importantly, it deepened pre-existing achievement gaps. According to recent data released by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, students have suffered a significant decline in achievement across several subjects and grade levels. The students who fared the worst were those who were already struggling prior to the pandemic, particularly Black and Latino students and students living in poverty. In early 2021, Congressional Democrats and President Biden passed the American Rescue Plan Act, which delivered the largest one-time federal investment in K-12 education in our nation's history. And by targeting this funding toward the highest need learners, we worked with the Biden administration to reopen schools safely with a focus on students' academic, social, and emotional recovery. In the short term, this historic funding helped schools bridge the digital divide and also avoid extended gaps in instruction. And in the long term, it has provided students, parents, and teachers with resources to address missed learning time. And thanks to the American Rescue Plan, school districts around the country, including in my home state of Oregon, have been able to hire teachers and tutors, keep their doors open during the summer for academic and extracurricular enrichment, renovate aging HVAC systems to improve the health and safety of students and staff, and design other evidence-based programs to combat missed learning time. For example, Portland Public Schools used COVID relief funds to make direct investments in students' academic, social, and emotional success and well-being. They hired learning acceleration specialists, invested in summer programming, and implemented professional development for teachers to help them effectively facilitate recovery from the pandemic. In Oregon, American Rescue Plan dollars made and continue to make a difference for students and families. I want to note that the CARES Act in early 2020 and the Consolidated Appropriations Act in late 2020 were bipartisan. But unfortunately, the Republican approach to missed learning time since then has been to leave schools to fend for themselves and to make repeated brazen attempts to fund unaccountable private schools with taxpayer dollars. In fact, Democrats on this committee are especially concerned at present with House Republicans' most recent efforts to defund public schools, including a proposed budget that decimates key resources for our children's education. Under this proposal, funding would be slashed from programs aimed at addressing missed learning time and supporting students from low-income families. It would kick teachers out of classrooms by eliminating funding that helps recruit, retain, and develop high-quality educators. Democrats have delivered on our commitment to helping students, parents, and schools overcome missed learning time, but those promises and policies are now being undermined, unfortunately, by extreme MAGA Republican agenda that's putting politics over people and culture wars over classrooms. Instead, I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join us in investing in public education and evidence-based programs that address missed learning time and focus on student success at every level. Finally, I want to remind my colleagues of some sobering COVID statistics. Since the start of the pandemic, more than 6,216,000 Americans were hospitalized and more than 1,135,000 Americans died. Yes, my colleagues and I are deeply concerned about missed learning, but I also urge us to keep in mind the lives lost as well as the lives saved by limiting exposure. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to introduce into the record, there's an article from Education Week titled "Over 1,000 Educators Died from COVID. Here's the Story of One." And from the Chalkbeat publication, "The Pandemic's Toll Study Documents Fatality Rates of Teachers, Childcare Workers in 2020.
Without objection, it's entered into the record.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you to our witnesses and look forward to a productive conversation.
The robust, thank you very much, Ranking Member Bonamici. The robust conversation is just beginning. Let's go to our this committee. Let me read the official statement, which says, pursuant to Committee Rule 8-C, all committee members who wish to insert written statements in the record date may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. after 14 days from the date of the hearing, which is August 9th, 2023. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days after the date of this hearing to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing, so it may also be submitted for the official hearing record. We both have here today both the big chair of the big committee of education and workforce as well as the ranking member. Dr. Fox, would you like to make any opening statement? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No opening statement, but I would like to welcome all of our witnesses today, and particularly Superintendent Catherine Truitt from the great state of North Carolina. She's doing a terrific job, and I'm very pleased that she's able to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll hold my questions till later.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's go with Ranking Member Bobby Scott. You are also recognized. And first of all, thanks for coming today. You're recognized for an opening statement should you wish to make one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear from the witnesses, but I would point out that when students were out of school because of the pandemic, obviously there was learning loss. The question isn't whether there was learning loss. The question is, what are we doing about it? As the ranking subcommittee chair mentioned, we invested the largest investment in K through 12 education in the history of the United States. with the expectation that that would be used to make up that learning loss. So we look forward to see what they did with the money. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Scott. Thank you so much. Let's get to it. And our first witness is no stranger to education. It's Dr. Nat Malkus. He's the Senior Fellow and Deputy Director, Education Policy Studies of the American Enterprise Institute. He has every credential. It's a full page, members. It's a full page of his credentials in your sheet. But let me tell you something special. There's a special place in heaven for middle school teachers. Dr. Malkus spent 4 years as a middle school teacher in Maryland and then earned his PhD in education policy and leadership from the University of Maryland at College Park. He has a BA in historical studies from Covenant College. We got to meet earlier and about him keeping score. He kept score of all of the data. There was a lot. And when we looked for what witness could bring that data before the committee of who knew what, when did they know it, and how the decisions were made, there was one guy. His name is Nat Malkus, and he is here today. So for our members, I think I told you, with the exception of Miss Ray, and by the way, welcome, we're glad to have you here. It's this 5-minute rule. So you have 5 minutes. I think we have a light to give you a guide. I'll kind of, if I do this, that's a silent signal to you to wrap it up, and you don't want to hear that. That means we've gone way too far. But Dr. Malkus, welcome. You are recognized for 5 minutes. Yeah, we'll go through them as they come. So Dr. Malkus, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Chairman Bean, Ranking Member Bonamici, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify here today. In March 2020, the pandemic abruptly shifted my work to studying schools' responses to it. That resulted in the first nationally representative data on districts' responses that spring. And the entire next year, AEI's Return to Learn tracker monitored in-person, hybrid, and fully remote instruction of 8,600 school districts every week. That data has proven critical to answering the question at the root of this hearing, how the pandemic school closures hurt students. The largest negative shock to student learning ever in the U.S., the pandemic's effects on student learning exceeded that of Hurricane Katrina, but affected tens of millions of students rather than hundreds of thousands. Slowly closing for decades, achievement gaps widened as poor, black or brown, and academically behind students fell further behind. Multiple factors drove these losses, but chief among them, extended school closures, a factor policymakers had control over. Unfortunately, reopening polarized politically early on, as a 2020 Brookings Institution analysis put plainly. There is no relationship, visually or statistically, between school districts' reopening decisions and their county's new COVID-19 cases per capita. In contrast, there is a strong relationship, visually and statistically, between districts' reopening decisions and the county-level support for Trump. AEI's Return to Learn tracker showed this data across that entire school year. As late as April 2021, when COVID cases were low and vaccines widely available, about a third of districts and counties that voted for President Biden had fully reopened, compared to 60% in Trump districts. That year, the highest percentage of Biden districts to open fully in person, 38% in June, never reached the lowest percentage of Trump districts, 40% in January. The correlation between politics and extended closures is clear, but the causes are not, as several related factors were more predictive than were local COVID case rates. The connection between closures and learning loss is clear. Merging education recovery scorecard data with AEI's Return to Learn data showed that the third of districts who were most in person in 2020-21 lost 44% of a year's progress in math. The most remote third lost 60% of a year, over a third more. Losses in reading were smaller, but the relative differences closures made were even larger. Numerous studies bear these stark patterns out. Extended remote learning wasn't the only source of learning loss. The instability of quarantines, spikes in chronic absenteeism, and disruptions in hybrid learning all hampered teacher capacity and student learning. Even schools that returned in person early faced strong pandemic headwinds, not all of which have yet died down. Academic recovery is a major priority. School districts received $189 billion in federal pandemic aid, and those funds went to many things, including academic recovery. Unfortunately, the pace of student progress is too slow. Recent data showed that most students learned more slowly than their pre-pandemic peers this school year. Unless that pace improves dramatically, hope for recovery for this academic generation is lost. I won't prescribe easy solutions for this daunting challenge, but increased urgency is an essential, if not sufficient, element. Promising responses such as intensive tutoring and increased learning time suffer from a lack of urgency. Though widely available, about 2% of students nationally have actually received high-intensity tutoring last year, and among the neediest, it's 4%. The "if you build it, they will come" model will fail without increased urgency. Extending school days or school years holds promise. Atlanta has proved it possible for districts and New Mexico for state, but these exceptions prove the rule. Significant expanded learning time is rare. Ultimately, only teachers can effectively communicate the urgency needed to engage families. Test scores show learning loss that students' grades do not. Parents will not act if teachers' feedback reflects business as usual. Communicating urgency is a difficult task to lay at the feet of beleaguered teachers, but if not them, who? Learning loss cannot be viewed as a past event, as something to move on from now. Pandemic learning loss has not yet cemented, but it is hardening fast. Inaction would be an abdication of our responsibilities and would resign students to a dimmer future. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in this important hearing. I look forward to the subcommittee's question.
Dr. Malkus, well done. Thank you very much for coming forward and for getting us started. Our next witness will be introduced by the ranking member. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my honor to introduce Ms. Mary Patricia Ray. She's from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Today, she's here testifying in her highest ranking position as a proud parent. She is the owner and founder of Top Drawer Strategies, a public policy consulting firm. She's an adjunct professor of law at Tulane University Law School. Ms. Ray has served on multiple community boards and currently chairs the Public Relations Committee for the Recreation and Park Commission for the Parish of East Baton Rouge. Ms. Ray received her bachelor's degree from The Ohio State University and a JD from Loyola University New Orleans College of Law. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Ray.
Ms. Ray, a very good morning. Welcome to the committee. You are recognized. Oh, and your microphone is, there you go.
Chairman Bean, Ranking Member Bonamici, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and committee members, thank you for the invitation to participate. My name is Mary Patricia Ray, and you heard my other credentials this morning. I'm more familiar with introducing myself in the context of those, but I am here in my highest ranking position as mom. My husband and I, Ira Ray, are parents to two beautiful boys who attend public school in East Baton Rouge Parish. Our sons, Henry Lee and Weber, are preparing to celebrate their birthdays next month. I have a long public history of advocating for public schools, teachers, and support staff in my home state of Louisiana. And as a mom, I'm also an outspoken and frequent critic of our school district and our state education leaders. So when I say they got something right, you should believe me. When our world shut down for COVID, I was 4 months pregnant with Weber, and I was already 2 years into my experience as the mother of a child with disabilities. Henry Lee attends school in an inclusive setting with the implementation of an individualized education plan, including speech and occupational therapy, to help him overcome the challenges of apraxia of speech. Our district took immediate precautions to protect the health and safety of our children. Within a few weeks, a schedule of virtual learning was implemented. This included small groups with our teacher, at-home exercises to connect our kids to their curriculum, hotspots were provided, and nutrition programs were delivered to our doorstep. Henry Lee received compensatory services for speech and OT and qualified for extended school year. Children in our district with severe disabilities and immune-compromised conditions were the most at risk of dying. Our son later befriended Carter Hart, a student living with cortical vision impairment and other disabilities that present challenges to learning in person, even on a good day. Because of our school reopening guidelines, Carter went almost 3 years without getting COVID, which posed an intense life-threatening risk for him. When he was fully vaccinated in January 2023 and picked up COVID, he only needed supplemental oxygen for 1 day. With Carter's mom's permission, I share this with you to fully explain what was on the line for our children, their lives. To suggest otherwise makes education conditioned upon each family and educator's willingness to risk their own lives. That coercive choice does not reflect American values or commitment to providing every child with the opportunities they need. So instead of making education accessible only for those with low risk, Congress supported all our children. By allocating $122 billion of American Rescue Plan funds for K-12 education, Congress recognized that extraordinary resources were needed to meet the moment. And I am so grateful they did, because my son's friend Carter is still with us. My son and every other child in America have suffered missed learning time, social deficits, behavioral health challenges, and yet unknown consequences of a global pandemic. But it is intellectually dishonest to talk about learning loss without acknowledging that many students were already behind and that there were achievement gaps, especially among students with disabilities, students of color, and low-income students already happening long before COVID. Congress has known that for generations. That's why it passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act decades before I, a child of the 90s, Mr. Chairman, was even born. The cause of achievement gaps are systemic, not merely the result of pandemic closures. Our public schools serve more than 80% of America's children, including more than 7.3 million with disabilities. Let's show those children what American problem solving looks like and acknowledge that before the pandemic and after, schools struggled to recruit and retain qualified educators. Students with disabilities were already reading and performing in math well below proficiency, and they dropped out of school at twice the rate of their non-disabled peers. And this was all before COVID. Given this reality, I urge Congress to provide additional funding so that the lessons we learned from COVID can be implemented after ARP funding ends. The targeted, remedial, and compensatory programs that are happening now must continue. As a mom from Louisiana, I speak for the least among us. Our schools consistently produce the lowest ranked student outcomes in the nation. Until recently, our teacher pay lagged behind the Southern Regional average for more than a decade. We already had challenges to improving public education before COVID-19 shook us to the core. I speak from the heart when I tell you that cutting funding to public schools is a death sentence for our children who also experience the highest incarceration rate in America. Nothing is partisan about the notion you cannot do more with less. And no one disagrees our children need more. They need more qualified teachers, more evidence-based services, career and tech ed, behavior and mental health services. They don't need more fighting over whether protecting them from a virus and keeping them alive was the right decision 3 years ago. They need our action now. I'm optimistic that you will also speak for the least among us and fully fund the needs of our children, spending your time focused on solutions rather than blame. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today.
Ms. Ray, thank you so much for your thoughts and for being a parent. And our heart, any parent out there feels where you are and the hardness, the challenge that you went through during those
Mr. Chairman.
times. Thank you. Our next witness is going to be introduced by our own Judge Moran. Representative Moran, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce Mr. Darrell Bradford, a native of Baltimore. Mr. Bradford is the president of 50CAN, the 50-state campaign for Achievement Now. Mr. Bradford leads communications and policy and recruits local leaders across the country to serve as executive directors of state CANs and advocacy fellows. He also leads the National Voices Fellowship, which focuses on education, policy, media, and political collaboration. He serves on several boards dedicated to putting the needs of students and families first, including Success Academy, charter schools, Yes, Every Kid, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, the advisory boards of the Alliance for Catholic Education at Notre Dame, and the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, the Pi Network, and was the founding board chair for EdBuild. We are exceedingly pleased to have Mr. Darrell Bradford here with us today. Mr. Bradford, thank you for being here.
Thank you for that glowing introduction, sir.
Mr. Bradford, you're welcome. We're glad to have you here. You're recognized.
Chairman Bean, Ranking Member Bonamici, Ranking Member Scott, thank you for having me today. So I've thought about how to organize this, and I'll just jump to the point given the amount of time that I have. So it is sophistry that people, that the narrative being sort of peddled in the public domain is that teachers' unions had no role in keeping schools closed longer than they needed to be closed. You can look at this as the culmination of a series of labor actions that started in in Kentucky and Oklahoma, but that really blew up in Chicago and in Los Angeles during the Democratic presidential primaries. At the time, those striking teachers who denied kids learning, which is the most common way we see, learning being denied from families right now is teacher strikes. They struck for pay increases. Democratic candidates during that election offered to triple Title I as a way to increase teacher pay at the local level. Teachers unions saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to sort of get teacher pay on the federal balance sheet. And though they never would have been able to strike in a national capacity before, there's no way they could have afforded it, COVID provided them with that opportunity. And I just want to say, I know a lot of people don't want to say this is an unpopular thing to say, but Mayor Muriel Bowser here in the District of Columbia had to file a temporary restraining order against her own teachers union when she attempted to get schools open. So Representative Bean, to your 90s references, the truth is out there, and I just urge everyone to go and seek that. So I was also a hardcore school closer. I think I should say this. In April of 2020, I was at the front of the line because people were scared. I was scared. I respect Mrs. Ray's point of view, and I just want to shout out State Superintendent Truitt, who said at the time that we should use the opportunity to make change because for the past 30 years, the system has failed millions of kids. And it's been just a disaster. I mean, I don't want to, hyperbole seems firmly worth using in this instance. Dr. Malkus talked about it a lot earlier. In New York City, where I lived for a very long time and have been for a very long time, 20 years worth of learning has been erased. This is a generational tragedy. You can look at the work of Dr. Mackie Raymond at Stanford, who says that not only is the gap essentially insurmountable, without additional acceleration, it will be even worse. Like it is not enough to simply get back to where we are. We have to do significantly more if we want to try to get back to where we are. Now, I know this committee has this question in front of it of what happened to the money. And there are lots of anecdotes out there, and I could point you to tons of places, but the New York Times is a good place to look. And I didn't do this on purpose, ranking member, but in Klamath County, they're spending 70% of their relief dollars to buy turf fields, renovate bleachers, build a gym, and resurface a parking lot. In Newark, New Jersey, where I worked for a very long time, Chalkbeat reported that Newark spent only 5% of its ESSER funding on tutoring. And I think, sadly, what's been proven is that if you give American school districts $190 billion in a black box with no accountability, they'll spend the money on themselves. That is the lesson. So there is good news, which is important, and a lot of state, local, philanthropic examples that we can look to, because I do think we need to be solutions-oriented. This is the biggest domestic policy tragedy or failure of our lifetime, in my humble opinion. You can look at New Jersey and Louisiana, which have passed bills that provide high-dosage tutoring to more children. Those are great examples. Mike Bloomberg and his Summer Boost program is a philanthropic effort in 8 cities across the country to give high-dosage tutoring to students. There have been investments in summer. Governor Ducey's AZ on Track in his last term. And I would also just like to highlight that Governor Brad Little, he used COVID relief and gave it directly to families. And to me, if in the future you're worried about what happens if you make a major infusion for education expenses, it could be best just to trust families. One last thing, we do need to look at the country's Catholic schools, particularly urban Catholic schools. They gave the proof in many cases that it was possible to open schools safely. I think we owe them a debt of gratitude, and they should be a part of the solution in the future. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bradford, thank you very much for being here and giving us your thoughts. Looking forward to some questions in just a bit. Our final witness is ready to go, but before she can start, she needs a proper introduction, and to do that, let's go to Illinois, where our own Representative Miller is standing by to give her that proper introduction. Representative Miller, you're recognized.
Thank you, and it's an honor to introduce Ms. Catherine Truitt, Superintendent of the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Superintendent Truitt's service in education began as a high school English teacher, where she spent 10 years in the classroom at both the high school and middle school levels. She has worked as a turnaround coach with underperforming school districts. And we're so thankful that you're bringing your experience to affect change. Ms. Truitt was appointed by Governor McCrory as his senior education advisor, and most recently, she served as chancellor of nonprofit Western Governors University. She's been superintendent since being elected in 2020, and we're so thankful to have you here.
Superintendent Truitt, welcome to the committee. We're glad to have you here. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Bean. Good morning to you all, to Ranking Member Bonamici and members of the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education. I'd also like to extend a special hello and thank you to Chairwoman Fox, who has faithfully represented the 5th District in my great home state of North Carolina. My name is Catherine Truitt, and I have the distinct honor of serving as North Carolina's State Superintendent, where I lead the Department of Public Instruction, which serves nearly 1.6 million students. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today, as the topic of lost instructional time is one that defined my vision for leading North Carolina out of the pandemic and helped to establish our road to recovery. Even before I took office in January of 2021, state chiefs around the country heard about the massive spending proposals coming to states, what would be known as ESSER III, from the then incoming president's administration. Knowing of this influx of federal funds about to flow into our state, and recognizing as a parent of 3 children how detrimental school closures were for our students, I immediately launched the Office of Learning Recovery and Acceleration in February of 2021. The office remains one of the first of its kind. When the massive influx of federal funding did come pouring into North Carolina, we were ready. My agency was able to provide local education leaders with an office dedicated to recovery and rooted in research and data. This was vital because many of our 115 school districts and more than 200 charter schools did not have the central office bandwidth or support to take on the massive exercise in planning and compliance that would be required with ESSER III. The Office of Learning Recovery and Acceleration began their work right away, producing a comprehensive report detailing the impact of learning loss on every individual student in North Carolina, which I have submitted to this committee for the record. As this analysis was based on student-level data instead of aggregate samples of students, it was one of the most comprehensive reports in the nation. The findings in this report allowed our agency to better target resources and prioritize funding for those students most affected and for areas of the state most in need. Importantly, it allowed us to continue developing and supporting district-run interventions to accelerate student learning. Following the release of the 2022 Lost Instructional Time Report, our agency recognized a need to convene school districts to help them explore how to effectively leverage their ESSER funding. We organized a 4-day summer convening in July of 2022 for school districts across the state, where leaders could gather and examine their findings alongside experts, using new and relevant data to help create evidence-based interventions to better serve students. During this convening, staff ensured that each district and charter school walked away with a plan for the next year outlining how their ESSER funding could support data-driven strategies for transforming teaching and learning in their districts and schools. I'm proud to say that the 2022 summer convening went so well that we just held our 2nd annual convening 2 weeks ago. With the 2022 Lost Instructional Time Report used as a benchmark to monitor progress and ensure North Carolina students continue to accelerate, our agency produced a 2nd report in April of this year. This 2023 report detailed the significant strides students made in the 2021-22 school year, and it specifically highlighted that the strongest gains were made in middle school math, which is where we encourage districts to invest heavily based on data from the first report. while our state has much more to do. North Carolina was unique and intentional in its approach to recovery and acceleration. During my time in office, we have been transparent, data-driven, and research-based every step of the way. We remain committed to working alongside our school districts, providing them with access to tools, data, and one-on-one sessions so they can make informed decisions about how to best serve their students. Our schools and districts have made incredible strides in helping so many of our students get back on track to their pre-pandemic performance. And while there is more work to be done, we are on the path to recovery. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Ms. Truitt, Superintendent Truitt, thank you very much for coming here and sharing North Carolina experiences as we may all get better. We will also observe the 5-minute rule as we begin asking questions. I will put the clock on Bean. Put the clock on Bean as I'll begin the first round of 5-minute questions. And my question goes to Dr. Malkus. Dr. Malkus, it all started with, you remember this? We just need 2 weeks. We need 2 weeks to stop the spread. That was it. And here we are 3 years later, we still have some federal agencies that aren't fully back at work yet. So some would argue that it was a dangerous place for a kid to be in school. And then as months unfolded, summer happened, data came in. So Dr. Malkus, you kept score. What did the data show about school closures during that summer or fall of 2020?
This is an important question because what happened that summer 2020, we can observe over the course of the year, and not only that year, but the next year when our tracker tracked masking policies across the same nationwide districts, those very early positions that districts and states took stood the test of time, even as COVID went down and up. Now, I talked in my testimony about how there was a big political split here. A lot of this went toward a early and ossified sense in these places about what's the right way to react to the pandemic. The data that we have over what happened over the course of the pandemic shows that masking measured at the county level in summer 2020 is a much better predictor of the duration of closures and masking 2 years later than COVID case rates were. This suggests that there was a lot of position taking early on, and rather than being responsive, much of our policy making and decision making regarding schools was stuck in summer 2020.
Thank you very much. To Mr. Bradford, some say, in fact, teacher unions now are saying that no one fought harder to get schools open than they did. Is that a true statement, Mr. Bradford?
I mean, true is relative, apparently. For me, again, I just think the evidence is very clear. In particular, and I don't want to call you out, Representative Miller, but in Chicago, the discussions of reopening schools were sort of responded to with the Chicago Teachers Union saying that an effort to try to reopen them was about sexism, misogyny, and racism. In New York and other places, frankly, teachers picketed with scythes and coffins. This is not the sort of activity of a group of people that are particularly interested in opening schools. And I do want to say this too, because I think this is important, and I just want to go back to it. I can remember when like March 13th, I think is what it was. That was that Friday. It was like Friday the 13th in March when the nation essentially shut down. And again, I was at the front of the line being like, we should do this. And the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers in New York, wanted to close down schools, and Bill de Blasio wanted to keep them open. And I was with the UFT. But over the summer, it became very clear, by August, it was incredibly clear, that what was happening was that teacher unions and places were working to sort of ban competition.
So you would say that answer is not true?
The answer is not true.
That's
yes.
what I
If
need
you
to
want me
know.
to be more assertive about it.
Thank you.
yes.
No, I appreciate your insight. I want to get another question into Superintendent Truitt. Some may say, what's the big deal? Okay, we're a generation behind. Why can't we just study extra hard this year and make up for it? Are we lost forever in the 90s, or can we make it up in 1 year? What's the big deal about this learning loss?
Well, the big deal is that it's going to take multiple years to recover, and some students may never recover because, as Ms. Ray rightly stated, many students were behind in their academic progress when the pandemic hit, which one could argue is why so many parents are seeking alternatives to their neighborhood public schools. Our data show that we measured our learning loss by converting the effect sizes to months of instructional
We've
time
got our
needed
challenge.
to catch up.
I've got just a few seconds left. Give us some good news. I want to end my questioning on some good news, on a bright outlook. Can you do that,
Yeah,
Superintendent
the good,
Truitt?
The good news is that North Carolina has gone all in on the science of reading. We used federal dollars to provide professional development for teachers on phonics-based instruction, and our K-3 foundational reading scores show that we've outpaced the rest of the nation.
It can be done. Thank you so much, Superintendent Truitt, for all you guys. It's so frustrating that the clock, we want to expand this, but let's continue. Here's the order, members, of which we will recognize members. We're going to go to Ranking Member Bonamici, then Ms. Miller, Mr. Bowman, Mr. Moran. Ranking Member Bonamici, you are recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's evident that mislearning time from the pandemic has hurt students academically, socially, and emotionally. So to address this challenge and to help close the gaps, we need investments in our public schools to help students catch up, to support teachers delivering high-quality instruction, to more meaningfully engage families. So instead of attacking how public schools responded to the pandemic with the information they had at the time, let's discuss how we can work together to help students and families recover equitably and effectively. So, Ms. Ray, I have 3 questions I'm going to try to get in 5 minutes. So recently, House Republicans released an appropriations bill that includes significant cuts to key education programs, including about an 80% cut to Title I. The bill also eliminates programs to support English learners, cuts teacher recruitment and retention, eliminates statewide family engagement centers, which of course are known to increase the quality and frequency of parental involvement. So as a parent, how would these budget cuts affect your children and their peers, and what difference would it make in their ability to fully recover from this learning time?
I'll answer quickly so you have time. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to employ another 90s song lyric. Isn't it ironic? Isn't it ironic that this Congress allocated funding for those programs, recognizing that they were needed, and is now about to take them away at a time when they're also screaming loudly about learning loss? Community family engagement is one of the most important things we can fund in our federal budget, and that's because what hasn't been mentioned up here is that children like mine, they don't have alternatives. I don't really care what Catholic schools did, because none of them will serve my child. That's not a solution for me. Funding the programs that work for my family is, and I hope we do that.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Ray, schools in Oregon, my home state, were some of the latest to reopen for in-person learning, but my state also has one of the lowest COVID death rates per capita. And I know timing for each community was different. But Ms. Ray, as a parent, how do you respond to the argument that school closures were too long or unnecessary?
I would respond that causing educators, whether they're in a union or not, and children like mine, to choose between their life or an education is the absolute most least American decision that we could make as a generation, a 90s generation or thereafter.
I appreciate that. I remember early on in the pandemic talking to an educator via Zoom when we were all in little boxes on a screen who said, I'm terrified to go back to the classroom. This was pre-vaccination. He said, because my wife works in a COVID unit, and I'm afraid I'm going to go in that classroom and pass the virus on to the students. So, Ms. Ray, research from the NWEA, the Northwest Regional Education Association, which happens to be in the district I represent, shows that students in grades 3 through 5 require anywhere from 2 to 4 months of schooling to catch up from missed learning time in reading and math. So access to a highly effective teacher during the school day can contribute to students' success. For example, a national board certified teacher can accelerate student learning by 1 to 2 months, with students of color and students from low-income families experiencing more significant benefits. So in your testimony, you mentioned a Teacher of the Year, We have one of those here on our committee. Representative Hayes is a National Teacher of the Year, but you mentioned an award-winning, highly qualified certified teacher, Mrs. Phillips. So how does a well-prepared, highly effective teacher make a difference for your children and their peers academically, socially, and emotionally?
Unfortunately, we lost our Teacher of the Year because when she tried to advocate for better resources, when all of her colleagues tried to advocate for better resources so that they didn't bring COVID home to their loved ones, they didn't die of COVID, and they didn't bring COVID to school to our kids, they were villainized. When they asked for more resources and better funding to support a salary that reflected they were risking our lives for our kids, they were villainized. It was said that they were politicizing things. So my answer to your question is, I won't know anymore what the impact of that would be. And I think that is one of the biggest tragedies of projecting and politicizing instead of looking for solutions. But I think it's pretty much common sense that a highly qualified, certified teacher with experience makes a difference for every child. And Mrs. Phillips did that for my disabled child for 1 year before we lost her. And we now have no Montessori certified teachers in our school. And I know, after speaking with them, that's in large part a result of how they were treated, because they wanted the dignity of work. A profession mostly made up of women and serving underserved and minority communities, saying that a decision to force them to go to work when it's not safe, it has an element of racism or classism to it. We're going to villainize that when it's true. That is absolutely shocking to me as a parent.
I appreciate that, Ms. Ray, and I also appreciate your comment about the Catholic schools. We know that private schools don't have to take everyone. They don't have to serve every student. So we need to be very cautious about making those comparisons. And I'm a little over, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Bonamici. Here's our order of questions now. It'll be Ms. Miller, Mr. Bowman, Mr. Moran. So she's the vice chair. Do you know she's the vice chair of this committee? And we're yielding 5 minutes to her. Ms. Miller from Illinois, you're recognized.
Thank you, and I'm really appreciative that we're having this hearing because I'm sure we'll all agree that our children are the hope of our future. So looking for solutions and how to do life better, how to do education and family better that's our goal. All of us can agree to that. So Dr. Malkus, in your testimony you stated that being in a Democrat district was highly correlated with school closure. That looks a lot like a clear example of leaders prioritizing politics over children. Why do you think this was the case? And then most importantly, how can we ensure that this never happens again?
This is an important question to make sure that we do not make the same mistakes in the future. I think that to some degree it was a fear to lead. I think there was politicization, but we saw studies and have done studies at AEI that looked at public opinion on closures. And indeed, we found that local public opinion actually reflected local leaders' decisions to close schools. We also found that public opinion changed when leaders reopened their schools. In other words, the reopening encouraged local opinion to see that it was safe and approve those decisions. That's the leadership that we needed in a time when we could see other examples across the country, across the nation, that reopening was safe, and we needed our leaders to strike forward and to make sure that option was available to families who needed it. And even when that option also included remote options for those who didn't. As we look forward, I think it's very important to look at the public health guidance that we get, particularly from the CDC, to ensure that is even-handed and clear, to allow local leaders to make clear decisions. And finally, that we weight the interests of kids higher than we did during the pandemic.
Thank you. And then also, Dr. Malkus, the left will concede that the pandemic caused learning loss. However, the evidence suggests that learning loss is far worse than it should have been because the Democrat politicians and their teacher union allies kept schools closed far longer than what was necessary. Can you share with us why you think they pushed for policies that they knew was going to cause additional learning loss? I know in a lot of my rural areas, they open the schools long before some of these urban areas that are, primarily Democrat districts. So why do you think that they push for these policies so hard?
It's hard to know on an individual, district by district basis, but there was sort of a pandemic of the same bug, right? Fear to reopen schools, even though we could see other examples. There were Catholic schools in the same district with the same exact COVID conditions that were proving it was possible. There were other countries in Europe that were coming back earlier. And look, even when the CDC had said, as long as you take some precautions in January, you can reopen schools, we still had disproportionate closures of about 30% of districts. That's complete closures in districts located in counties that voted for Biden. So I really think that the reign of fear went too long, and we needed more courageous leadership in the face of that uncertainty.
Well, I know that in early 2021, I proposed an amendment that schools that were still remaining closed allowed parents to have the money that they were taking, and now we know either not spending or squandering, and allow those parents to find alternative educational opportunities for their children, including tutoring. And it's really a shame that they weren't forced to do that when they refused to open. And by the way, every Democrat voted against my amendment to let parents access that money to hire tutors or send their children somewhere else. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miller. The order of questions now is Bowman, Moran, Hayes. Let's go to New York, where Mr. Bowman is recognized for his series of questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Before I get started on my questions, I just want to start with this simple one. And this is to everyone in the chamber, not just to our witnesses. Raise your hand if you lost someone due to COVID or you know someone who lost someone due to COVID. Raise your hand. Okay, that's like the whole chamber. Okay. COVID killed 1.135 million Americans and counting. That's more Americans that were killed during the Civil War and World War II combined in a shorter period of time. Let's say we would have kept the schools open. Isn't it likely, yes, kids were not as harmed as other people, but kids are taught by teachers who may have some immunocompromised situation going on. Kids go home to parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles and live in the community and travel. So while kids may have not been seriously sick or killed by COVID, they can pass the illness on to others who will then die from COVID. This is well documented. That being said, I think it's fair to say if we would have kept schools open, more people would have died due to COVID. So we're talking here about learning loss, which is the incorrect term, by the way. The more correct term is learning disruption or disrupted learning. Because the way the brain works, it doesn't work in a way where learning is lost. That implies that you need to go find it. That implies that it's somewhere that it can't be located. Learning doesn't happen at a period of time in a vacuum and then you move on and then you can't get it back unless you go find it. It may have been disrupted, yes, because we experienced a trauma that is unprecedented in world history. And that's a word that no one has used up until this point. Trauma. I encourage you all to review an ACE study that was done in the medical field several decades ago. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. ACEs, the study shows that toxic stress and complex trauma impacts the brain's development in people 18 years of age and younger. Look up the study. The world experienced a complex trauma, which is going to impact the brain's development, particularly the prefrontal cortex. If that has happened to our kids and then they go back to school, of course you're going to see disruptions in learning. There is another pandemic that has been going on since the beginning of American history, and that is the underinvestment and disinvestment in poor schools, in poor communities, particularly black and brown. That is a pandemic that was here way before COVID, which is why we see an achievement gap in our schools and why kids in wealthier school communities do better than other kids. And now we're having a conversation behaving as if we're really concerned about learning loss, while my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to cut funding to Title I, to community schools, and to resources for our most vulnerable people, especially those who receive SNAP and TANF benefits. What are we talking about? We're not being honest about the full conversation here. And so if learning loss is something we really care about, and again, it's the wrong term, it's disrupted learning, we need to invest in our teachers, invest in our children, and invest in our schools and communities that have been historically neglected. And I'll close with this, and Ms. Ray, I'm going to try to give you a moment to respond to my comments. I'm sorry I went too long. But I don't know where we're getting this idea of this disrupted learning is going to lead to generations falling behind. I have a doctorate in educational leadership from Manhattanville College. I ran a middle school for 10 and a half years. In 2016, my middle school had the #1 growth scores of any middle school in New York City. We moved kids from level 1 to level 3 on standardized tests at a higher rate than anyone else in New York City. We did that in 1 year. Why are we talking about generations? We need to have a conversation about how learning works and be honest about that in this committee. And I hate standardized tests, by the way. We need project-based learning and more holistic learning in our schools that includes the arts and sports and tech and things that kids actually care about and actually contribute to a 21st century economy. Sorry, my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Here's the order remaining right now: Moran, Hayes, Owens, Scott, Fox. Let's go to Texas, where Representative Moran is standing by for his questions. He is recognized.
Thank you, Dr. Malkus. I want to start with you. One of the comments that my colleague just made, Mr. Bowman, I think I wrote the quote down correctly. He said if we would have kept schools open, more people would have died from COVID. Does this bear out in the evidence and the statistics that you've looked at across the nation?
It's certainly the case that when people gathered during COVID, there was theoretically a danger of transmission and that COVID led to deaths. This is clearly a concern. When we look back at the evidence, and this is not as of late, it was in October, November 2020, there were claims that actually the evidence appears that schools are not spreading COVID. If you look at the death rates among children, they are just a fraction, like a very small number. And the evidence on whether schools, many of which were open during this time, with quarantines in place and measures to mitigate transmission, what have we not seen? We have not seen clear studies, and we would expect to see hundreds of them that would say actually large swaths of the country reopened and deaths resulted. There are some marginal effects in some places. They do not stand up against the weight of the costs of widespread school closures, and some of the transmission that we saw was because it was not done as well controlled and with reasonable mitigation strategies in place, as we saw elsewhere.
Yeah, I haven't seen a statistical connection between opening up earlier and having higher death rates among either adults or children in those areas. And in fact, when I was a county judge in Smith County during the time of the pandemic, when we talked about how to deal with the pandemic as it came on us in 2020, we allowed our school districts to make decisions on their own as to what was best for their school districts. And Tyler Independent School District was one of the first, if not the first, large school district in the state of Texas to reopen in the fall of 2020 after the main wave of the pandemic. And in fact, that school did not see any increase in and did not have any deaths among children throughout the pandemic. And we did not see statistical increases compared to other counties that decided to make other decisions, or other schools that made other decisions as it related to adult deaths per capita in the state of Texas. And that year, learning based on the state's testing was at its highest level and best level ever for Tyler ISD. A lot of that because they actually returned back to normal school year. For those that were faced with medical difficulties where they were at higher risk, did you see that school districts generally provided exemptions for those kids and allowed them to stay home to make accommodation for those kiddos?
In that first full pandemic year, it was standard procedure and almost universal across the country. When you reopened, there was a remote option available, and oftentimes there were multiple remote programs available.
So it was possible to both accommodate those students that were at higher risk and also to generally accommodate those students that needed to push forward with that learning. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. The decision to go fully remote would force a single decision on every student in a district, and many districts did that well into the spring of 2021.
Would anybody on the panel disagree with me to say that the extended school closures during COVID will likely result in larger learning gaps between economically disadvantaged children and non-economically disadvantaged children? Would anyone disagree with that? Would anyone disagree with, and Ms. Ray, pop up if you disagree with that, would you disagree with the statement that those school closures and the learning gap resulting from it will likely lead to increased poverty in the future? Would anyone disagree with that?
I would say that to describe that as a correlation is incorrect, and that the way the word correlation has been used throughout this hearing has been highly incorrect usage.
Well, I'm asking statistically if there's a correlation then between education and poverty, and I hear you saying there's not, but clearly there is, right?
Correlation means there's no other predominant cause. It means that those two things, poverty and closure, are so closely connected that there's no
I
other
said
cause.
poverty. I said education and poverty. That was my question. Would you agree that there's a statistically significant correlation between education and poverty?
A lack of education definitely contributes to poverty, yes, sir.
And a lack of education that leads to poverty also leads to people in high areas of poverty being more likely to be a victim of crime, more likely to commit a crime, more likely to commit suicide, more likely to exhibit worse mental health outcomes. And those are all documented scientific studies. Do you disagree with any of those statements?
I don't disagree with any statement that you have made in that sentence.
Mr. Moran, thank you very much. Thank you very much. There's a new order lineup, and we're going to go Hayes, Owens, DeSomnier, Fox, and Scott. So let's go to Connecticut, where Mrs. Hayes is recognized for her series of questions.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I had pages of questions prepared, but none of them seem relevant because it is becoming more and more apparent to me that the purpose of this committee is not to find solutions or reach a conclusion that is best for children. I agree that there is a correlation between poverty and education and arrests and all of the things that my colleagues just laid out. However, we're having a hearing where they are trying to disinvest in all of these things. So if you truly believe that there is a correlation between education and these disproportionate outcomes, then why are we having a hearing that is attempted to remove funds that was meant to reach our most vulnerable children? I appreciate all the Monday morning quarterbacking here today, but we don't need Brookings data to tell us that if kids are not in school, they won't learn. That's pretty basic. It's pretty simple. But we also know if kids are dead, they don't learn. I am a parent, so when you're talking about the marginal effects of this, I am an educator and I am a parent. I was not willing to risk my child on information that was not widely available to us or that we didn't know. So we took the approach with all the information we could at the time to save the lives of children. I don't know what anyone else was doing, but that's what I was doing. I voted in support of 2 presidents to make sure that our schools had the resources that they needed. Ms. Ray, I echo the same thing as you about the irony that we're hearing today. Because isn't it ironic that members of this panel are blaming teachers and teachers' unions while also arguing that their children should have been back in front of those same teachers? So either the teachers are good for your kids or they're not. You can't have it both ways. Because you're arguing that the teachers wanted to keep schools closed and they were detrimental to learning and everything is the fault of teachers, but in the same breath saying, and our kids should have been back in front of those teachers with no disruption. You don't understand trauma. You don't understand what is happening in our classrooms. You don't understand what's going on with our kids if this is the conclusion that you have come to. I don't even know where to begin with the questions because I don't anticipate that I will get any meaningful answer from people who come before this committee as experts in the field of education without bringing out the lens and saying that this is, you talk about generational, you talk about decades. This did not happen in 20 months during a pandemic. This is the result of disinvestment over decades, as you've said. So the response for that to be to continue to disinvest just blows my mind. So my question is, which is not even a real question because I don't want an answer, if we have another pandemic, are you proposing that we don't shut schools down? If we have another global crisis, are you proposing that we do nothing? Because that does not work for me. I don't even know where to begin. We have people on the panel, Superintendent Truitt, you talk about how you created these reports, how you use federal funds to create programs to support teachers. That's what we sent that money to you in order to do, for you to make decisions on the ground that would best support your students and your communities. And this idea that only Democratic-led communities or Biden districts are falling behind, 6 of the top 10 lowest performing states for test scores in school districts are led by Republican governors. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? I hail from the state of Connecticut where my governor just announced today that he's going to use some of these funds to have intense math and science tutoring for kids to bring them back up to date, to close some of these gaps, to begin to do the things that we need to do. All of these things about schools had protocols in place. They could social distance kids. I worked in a school where the windows didn't open. I worked in a school where if all my kids were in school on the same day, 2 had to sit at my desk and I had to borrow a chair from next door. So this idea that we could have put kids 6 feet apart, open windows, did all these ventilation things, presupposes that we hadn't disinvested in schools for the last 30 years and all of these things were in place. So if that's what you believe, there is nothing I can do to help you. There is nothing I can say to bring you to the reality of this century in 2023, where we have schools and buildings without proper ventilation that have on average 2 vacancies for every grade, that have school teachers that are not certified, that have all of these things that affect student learning. So if we are not looking at all of the social determinants and making sure that all of those things are in place first, before we jump to, and it's because schools were closed so that we could save kids' lives and that's why they're behind, then there is nothing I can say here. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hayes. We now will go to Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens will be followed by DeSamene, Fox, then Scott. Representative Owens, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I get started with my opening statement, I think what's happening with COVID is now Americans are now seeing what's been happening to our black children for decades by these unions. We get a report in 2017 that 75% of the black boys in the state of California cannot read and write, and nobody says a word. Nobody thinks that's crazy. Nobody thinks that something should be addressing this process where unions are focusing on themselves, their institution, and not those black young men that will go out and become very, very unsuccessful, very hopeless in the future. This has been going on for quite a while, my friends. So the upside of COVID is, if there is one, is that parents across the country now have empathy for those who've been used, abused, and discarded for so many decades. So I'm very happy that we're now having this conversation, and we're going to, yes, find out what the cause is. We need to find out what the cause is. We never go this route ever again to give this kind of power to people who do not care about our kids, care about the billions of dollars they're going to get, the power they get, the ability to shut things down. And right now, yes, we will be losing a lot of kids with 40%, and I wish I was trying to find that study. 40% of black kids in many of these blue states and cities will never go back to school again. So no, we're not going to ever get them back, and we need to recognize that. Okay, learning loss results from school closures during the COVID-19 pandemic have taken a historic toll on our students and their education. This loss of learning is highlighted by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which shows the history scores of 8th graders have fallen below a level that they were in 1994. That's a 30-year low. Civics tests for 8th graders have fallen for the same level as 1998. The results from National Center of Education Statistics, which administer the NAEP long-term reading and mathematics assessment for 13-year-old students, are particularly concerning. Students' math scores have regressed by 33 years, and reading scores have dropped to 50-year lows. If you cannot read, you cannot learn, you cannot ever hope. Ignorant and free can never be. Nearly a half a century of steady incremental reading gains have been wiped out in 2 years by self-centered union nonsense. For many young people of this generation, they're projected to lose earning $44,000 less over their lifetime due to these the demanded closures, and not to mention the impact of mental health, suicides, depression caused by 2 years of isolation. Here are some of the union demands, the ransom note that altered the lives and futures of millions of children in our country. Medicaid, now this has nothing to do with school. Medicaid for all, banning charter schools, banning standardized tests, paying teachers' mortgages and rent, increased property taxes on businesses, financial support for illegal aliens. And what does that have to do with teaching our kids anything? And of course, the union in LA was demanding $250 million for their union. The concession by our Democratic colleagues across the aisle over this time was $190 billion in taxpayer funds, which is 3 times more of the funds spent in 1 year. Much of this is unaccounted for, wasted, unused, and going into union coffers. We need to find and implement solutions that help our students bridge the learning gap and excel in their academic and career aspiration. Moving forward, we must ensure that our children can never, ever be used as ransom. Our children are our future, not our bargaining chips or political hostages. That's why I introduced a bill that ensures a bright future of the most vulnerable children, our Title IX kids, will never be threatened again by adults negotiating for more pay. Our poor children should never be used, abused, and discarded again in this manner. The legislation that I presented, called Kids in Class Act, allows for Title I funding to follow the child once a school closes to if another pandemic or union strikes. These funds can be used by the parents to seek support outside the closed schools, educational support services like tutoring, educational classes outside the home, private school tuition, and educational therapies for students with disabilities. This should be something that we all agree on, in case the child is our priority. Dr. Malkus, one of the things that concern me about the learning loss is that high poverty minority students seem to be particularly left behind. Can you talk more about the data that looks like, what the data looks like for high poverty and minority students, and why these children seem to be especially hard hit?
There's 3 factors to pay attention to on this question. The first is there was a downturn in student achievement that preceded the pandemic. Around 2013, we started to see a slight downturn. The second thing is closures were disproportionately difficult for poor and minority and low achieving students. For each week they were closed, and those closures lasted longer for those students. So holding all things constant, they got a 1-2 punch during the pandemic, and they'll be paying for it for some time.
Thank you, Dr. Malkus, and
Thank
thank
you.
you,
No, you're back. Thank you so much.
Representative Owens. Here's our order. Desaulniers, Fox, Scott, and Kiley. Let's go to California. Representative Desaulniers, you're recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panelists and the chair and the ranking member for this important discussion, such as it is. Speaking of California, I'm reminded of a quote by a colleague of mine in the state Senate when we were going around the state 15 years ago, looking at intersession summer learning loss in the state. So it's been happening for a while. And he represented a district in Los Angeles, disadvantaged district. He used to say, he said this at one of the meetings down there, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you always got. And that in the context of a social model in the last 2 generations that's changed dramatically. We don't live in a world of Ward Cleaver anymore, fathers knows best. And certainly in the state I have represented, that dynamic is very strong, particularly in disadvantaged communities, but everywhere. You don't have single parent, or you have a lot of single parent households. You've got a lot of 2-income households, and it is has a disproportionate effect depending on where you are on the economic scale. So what do we do to fix it? And in this instance, we followed what the science told us, what the professionals at CDC told us, to protect kids and their families. So in that context, and what we're talking about priorities right now, and I'm trying to get the wisdom of Solomon in here, Ms. Ray. Representative Thompson and I, when I first got here, Glenn Thompson, we worked on family engagement centers, knowing that this model had changed forever, for better or worse. So what do we do about it? So we worked in a bipartisan way to fund, and we've grown it every session I've been here, to get family engagement centers. It was led by the National PTA, so that these busy families, and again, disproportionately, communities of color and poor communities had a bigger problem, but it's everywhere. So in the appropriations that we're dealing with now, we're going to zero out the funds we've given to family engagement centers. Ms. Ray, could you speak to that about how families need to be able to connect with superintendents, with the teachers, with the counselors, to make sure that they're part of their kids growing up, and particularly coming out of COVID after having spent the last 3 years off and on dealing with the pressure of 2-income households, long commutes, and trying to help their kids be successful with things like family engagement centers?
Yes, sir, and I want to thank you in particular for your long history of working on behalf of children with disabilities who are missing from too many of these conversations. Without family engagement centers, districts like mine, where we have a majority minority student population, where most of our children qualify for free and reduced lunch, parents cannot navigate the complex opportunities that are available, and they may not even know they exist. Laws that Congress passed generations ago to recognize that disrupted learning is happening are very hard for parents to take advantage of. They're hard to implement. They're complicated because they require individualized education plans. And children that need other resources, even children without disabilities that need to access programming to make sure they are advantaged, are not going to get those services if we take funding away for those community engagement centers. I think it's one of the most important things that the members of this subcommittee could do to enhance what's going to come out of the coming budget process, is to advocate for that funding to stay in the budget and to increase. Without family engagement centers, for example, if we ever had to shut down schools again, I just want to make clear that these options to stay home that have been mentioned, there weren't devices available. There wasn't assistive technology for everyone. Teachers weren't trained. Parents weren't trained in how to do that. Those parent engagement centers were a point where parents could go to find out what those resources were going to be. We cannot take them away now.
And on disabilities, Governor Pat Brown years ago was faced with a growing disability community, and there was pressure to institutionalize kids. So we changed, and it was a Republican legislator in the state assembly then said, no, we're going to put them in the community and give them the resources that led to IDEA. So now we're going to flatline that budget in the current appropriations. Speak to your life experience about how difficult that will be for, again, one of the most disadvantaged communities, the disabled, particularly disabled kids and their parents.
To cut that funding means you don't believe that children like mine can learn. If you cut that funding and you tell my child he can't learn, first of all, you're wrong. Second of all, you should not be in Congress.
Well, in the financial model, I mean, we can institutionalize people and continue to institutionalize people, which is a horrible moral decision, but financially, it's also horrible.
For those who care more about the budget than disabled people, sure. Pick from a buffet of reasons, but please just do the right thing.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will now go to the chair of the full subcommittee, Dr. Fox. Honored to have you here. You are recognized for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and once again, thanks to our witnesses for being here. Superintendent Truitt, one of the arguments we hear frequently from the left is that the federal government must spend more money. And yet we've seen states like North Carolina be remarkably successful with existing resources. What would you say to Democrats who claim that learning loss can't be fixed without billions of dollars in new taxpayer dollars at the federal level?
Thank you for the question. You know, the premise of the Office of Learning Recovery that I created in February of 2021 was to ensure that our resources that we were getting from the federal government that we would be able to be good stewards of that money. 90% of that money went straight to districts. And we have some districts in North Carolina, which is an 80% rural state, that maybe only have 3 or 4 people in their central office. And so the idea that they would get money that was time limited, that had to be spent in a relatively short period of time without any data on where that learning loss was very daunting for them. And I want to make sure that the committee understands that North Carolina was very unique in setting up this Office of Learning Recovery and in the data that we provided in a very timely amount of time. So that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you. Dr. Malkus, you mentioned that parents aren't taking advantage of all the resources available to them. How can local or state level leaders make sure these resources reach kids while also not encouraging government overreach?
Well, I think there is the main onus on this is on teachers. Teachers have the most influence on students' learning. I also think that there is a role for the bully pulpit, for local and state and federal policymakers to make clear how vital this issue is. This learning loss is it is apocalyptic, especially for low-achieving students. It cannot be stressed highly enough. We have seen inadequate focus on it, and I understand the calls for, well, don't we need more spending? Indeed, but we did spend a great deal of money, and in a great deal of places, it was sent out without enough guidance, without enough reporting, and so I understand the reluctance to spend more on a black box when much of that money is not being spent well, or when the institutions we're asking to communicate to parents the urgency of their children's plight means that we offer programs and students are not showing up. This is not an easy task, but I think raising the alarm before pandemic learning loss is over, finished, something that we have washed our hands from and just hoping for the best is an essential aspect in this fight.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Bradford, I know a large focus of your work is school choice. I think school choice is absolutely essential to getting students back on track. Over the last 3 years, we saw states massively expand choice programs. How do you think school choice can empower parents and get students back on track?
Thank you, Congresswoman Fox. So by some reports, 1 million kids are no longer going to their neighborhood public school, and about 2/3 of those kids have chosen charter schools or other kinds of school options, be they homeschooled or private school or whatever. So on the one hand, I would just say the obvious, no school is going to work for every child. On the other hand, I would say what has presented itself is an America where parents are thinking much more critically about matching their child's aspirations and where they attend school. So I think this is all a very good thing. I think this approach should be essential to how we think about the system that we want, not the one we've been interrogating all day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let's go to the ranking member, Ranking Member Scott from Virginia, you're recognized, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Malkus mentioned the political dynamics involved in school closures. I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record a National Public Radio article showing the death rate in Trump counties as almost 3 times higher than other counties, and the Hill article, which associates that difference in death rates to vaccine politics. Yes, unanimous consent.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I don't know how that's relevant to this, but if you're going to blame people for closing schools and inflicting learning loss, maybe you can associate those articles to see who gets blamed for what. Ms. Truitt, you obviously weren't surprised to find students with a reduced academic achievement when they weren't in school, but rather than complaining about it and blaming people, you focused on actually doing something about it. Can you, it sounds like you started with getting data. Can you tell me why it was important to get student-level data?
Yes, in North Carolina, the 10% holdback from ESSER 3 was, by law, able to be appropriated by our General Assembly. And so we wanted to be able to provide them, as well as districts who, again, got 90% of those funds, the information that they needed to best serve individual students. So kind of taking a scattershot approach and just investing in programs that may or may not improve learning outcomes for students, in my opinion, was not an option. So in doing a population study, which means that we looked at the learning loss of every single student, and we're able to determine by student and by subgroup which subject suffered the most, we were able to then tell districts, here is what we suggest you spend your ESSER dollars on, and here are some vetted resources we think would match up best with what your students need.
Armed with that data, what kind of interventions did you recommend for students most in need?
So we looked at a lot of districts did summer bridge academies so that we were able to help 5th graders transition to 6th grade, 8th graders to 9th grade. We looked at a lot of math boot camps because middle grades math suffered the worst in our population study. We also, as I mentioned, invested a lot of money in teacher professional development. And we also stood up a statewide high dosage tutoring effort.
Did these interventions cost money?
They did, and but what I would let the committee know is that our districts are still sitting on $47.7 million of their ESSER 3 funds.
And does that mean that they have the ability to continue providing the summer support, the tutorial services, and other services needed to catch up?
Yes, sir.
Does your data, are you doing continuing testing to find out where the students are?
We are.
And based on what is working and what might not be working, what recommendations can you suggest outside of the pandemic?
To improve education?
Yes.
So I would say that we need to not run away from accountability, that standardized testing lets us know where we are falling short with which subgroups. Had it not been for No Child Left Behind, we wouldn't know that our Black and brown students were experiencing the kinds of gaps that they were. So in a time where some states are running away from accountability, North Carolina is running toward accountability, but we need to include other measures of accountability aside from standardized tests. And that means things like chronic absenteeism. If children are not at school, they cannot learn. We also need to be holding our districts accountable for whether or not students are participating in career college education, career technical education, so that we can once and for all get rid of the narrative that the only pathway to the middle class is with a 4-year college residential degree.
Thank you. A study came out right before the pandemic that showed widespread problems with heating and ventilation systems. Obviously, if you can open a school during an airborne pandemic, you'd like a good ventilation system Did you find many schools needing to fix their ventilation systems
Yes,
before
I
they
did.
could open?
Yes, sir. And ESSER 1 was incredibly helpful in that mitigation of the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Scott, thank you so much. To close this out, let's go to California, where the sub-chair of the Workforce Protection Subcommittee, Representative Kiley, is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Malkus, in your written testimony, you write that the pandemic caused the largest negative shock to student learning the country has ever seen. You said that the learning losses exceeded those from Hurricane Katrina, and said achievement gaps widened over the course of the pandemic. Would you say that those losses were mainly the result of the pandemic itself or the government's response to it?
This is a great question and an important one, so thank you for it. Typically speaking, we are looking at learning loss that was what was the trajectory of pre-pandemic learning, and what did we know well before the pandemic started and then well after the pandemic started. That means that some of the learning loss that we see, and we see it in schools that were also in person, was due to the fact that they were closed all spring unexpectedly. And we were building a plane as we were flying it down the runway to educate those students remotely. In addition, there is some of the total learning loss that occurred in the 2020-21 school year. The fact of the matter is that we see large differences in between those two groups, even though for the spring they had the same missed learning. So that suggests that the difference that we see between them was actually more important because of the differential policy decisions in districts to stay longer. In other words, they both would have had some of the learning loss no matter what. Extended closures were actually more of a differential than the overall differentials.
And the evidence is pretty clear at this point that districts and states that stays closed longer did more harm to their students. Is that right?
That is correct.
And your organization had a tracker for in-person learning. Do you recall which state did the worst in terms of getting students back in the classroom?
I do not have that information off the top of my head, and
I actually just checked it. It happens to be my state of California, very much against what I advocated for. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, issued a statewide shutdown order heading into the fall of 2020. Do you recall, what was the state of the evidence right then as far as the harm of keeping kids out of school versus having them in school?
In early fall 2020 at reopening?
That's right.
It was mixed, and there was a pandemic fog. Some states were blazing ahead. California was not.
How about in the spring of 2021, specifically March, the California supermajority rejected an amendment to open schools. I was actually the author of that amendment. What did the evidence say in March of 2021 about the harms of keeping kids out of school versus having them in school?
By March of 2021, the Centers for Disease, the CDC, had issued clear evidence that it was safe to open schools with mitigation strategies, and it had issued that 2 months prior to the time you're talking about.
By the way, all this time, the governor himself had his own kids in person in private school. What does that tell you about his belief about the benefits versus costs of having kids in school in person?
I will not speak to the governor's own motivations. I'll let you lead your own conclusions on that. However, our family did have to take steps to remove our students largely because we placed our students because we knew that they would be open during the pandemic.
Could you just summarize for us then the harm that we know of now that a state like California did by shutting down its schools unnecessarily for so long?
I believe that these will be dramatic changes from what otherwise would have been. I understand there were differences in learning trajectories before that. Believe me, this is my business. But the pandemic has some of its own consequences. These consequences were dire. They were more dire for disadvantaged people, disadvantaged students in terms of learning loss, and it will be more dire down the line in terms of their life outcomes. All the evidence that we have suggests that this is pretty clearly the case. Anyone concerned with equity should be concerned
That's
with
right.
pandemic learning loss.
And I believe this is the greatest domestic policy error, the most consequential domestic policy error in the modern history of this country. And frankly, the Biden administration was complicit in it. They went after governors who didn't want to have kids, young children, wear masks in classrooms. They didn't say anything about governors like Gavin Newsom in California that refused to open schools. But frankly, you know, we had a lot of schools that were failing well before the COVID shutdowns. And I think that, in a sense, what the shutdowns did, if there's any silver lining at all, is it opened a lot of eyes to the way our education establishment works, that it's really not about the kids. In a state like California, it's never about the kids. But the good news is, I think we're seeing a lot more people now realizing that. Eyes have been opened, and I think there is a growing movement in this country to reorient public education towards a paradigm that is student-centered and parent-directed. Thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back to the chair.
Mr. Kiley, thank you very much. This is the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education. If you're just tuning in, we've just completed a lively discussion. Members, thank you so much for jumping in and making this a lively discussion. We now know that learning loss is real. We've spent a lot of money, and we're still determining the full effect of that money, and that this committee has a lot of work to do to catch up to where we were. It's not just so much states competing with each other, it's America competing with the rest of the world. Next month, millions of students will be returning to school, and they will be asked, what did you do over the summer? 2 students that are returning to school will answer, what did you do over the summer? They will say, I spent my summer as an intern in the Education and Workforce Committee. Those students are Megan Heckelman from the Minority Office and Claire Houchin from the Majority Office. Could those 2 stand? Megan and Claire, if you're here, please stand up. I want to recognize both of them. Let me tell you, before we clap, hold on one thing, because both sides agree these 2 young ladies have very bright futures. But here's the secret to succeeding. When they were given tasks, and they were given a lot, they always performed with a smile and said, I will get it done. So as they go back, Megan will be going back to Boston College, and Claire Houchin will be going back to Ashland University. Let's give them a big round of applause for their service to the committee. What's that? Do you want to do? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And I'm going to, before we adjourn, I'll recognize the ranking member for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, today we discussed mislearning, which I think Mr. Bowman, Representative Bowman, aptly described as disrupted learning in K-12 students, and how the pandemic exacerbated the difficulties in closing long-standing opportunity and achievement gaps, particularly for Black and Latino students. And I hope our colleagues across the aisle will work with us, with congressional Democrats, to further assist educators and schools in recovering from the pandemic and in providing every child with a well-rounded, world-class education. I want to note that what students in schools do not need is extremist MAGA Republican culture wars, and they don't need devastating cuts to education funding. These words and actions are harmful to students. They can cause additional stress and burnout among educators, and I implore my colleagues to reject them in favor of policies that actually improve public education. And I want to note there was a discussion in our hearing today about prevention. How do we keep this from happening again? Well, one thing we can do is invest in not just in education, but also in public health, and make decisions based on science. Dr. Malkus, at one point you mentioned Europe and compared with Europe. What you didn't see in Europe was mask wars and vaccination opposition. In Europe, people wore masks and got vaccinated because that's based on science. I had a conversation with the superintendent for a small school district in Oregon at the height of everything, and she was beside herself. She said, I don't know what to do because my parents are calling. They want their students in a classroom with a teacher who's vaccinated. My state has a religious exemption. But all of a sudden, half the teachers have found religion and they don't want to get vaccinated. And by the way, I can't get medication to deworm my horse. Those weren't decisions that were being based on science. So we need to make sure we're making decisions based on science. And then I also want to correct a statement, Mr. Bradford's written testimony. In Mr. Bradford's written testimony, he stated when discussing teachers' unions, for example, virtual charter schools saw increased enrollment due to brick and mortar schools closing, so a cap was enacted in Oregon at their behest, referring to the teachers' unions. That's just not the case.
That is an article in the Wall Street Journal. I'm happy to send it to you, Congresswoman.
You can send it to me, Mr. Bradford, but I served in the legislature in Oregon on the Education Committee more than a decade ago, and a cap was in place long before COVID. And that was because virtual charter schools were taking a significant amount of public money with serious equity issues and without evidence of success.
I'm happy to send it to you.
Thank you. I just want to correct that for the written record. Because
I'm
that
happy
cap
to send it to you.
The cap was in place
Absolutely.
long before. So, Mr. Chairman, I remain committed to working together to advance the interests and well-being of every student, parent, and teacher. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Ms. Bonamici, thank you so much, Ranking Member. It's great to work with you. And without objection, Mr. Bradford, if you will submit that article, we'll include it as part of the record. What I've learned in my time in the education sector, if we truly want to make a difference, let's empower parents. Let's empower parents. If we're going to put more money in it, let's let parents choose where that money is spent. So maybe if it's a private school, it's a public school, if a charter school or homeschool, whatever it is, let them make that choice. And that's something that we can go for today. Our members, you were outstanding. Let me get clearance to see if we can adjourn. Are we ready? Yes. Guess what? Breaking news here that we have a handful of other interns that we want to recognize, including Elizabeth Payne. If you're here, please stand. We'd love to recognize you. Elizabeth Payne, Savoy Adams, Madeline Lucas, Malik Kalasho, Christian Jackson, Eli Smolin. So wherever you are, they're probably doing some filing and letter writing in the back, but we appreciate your service, and this whole complex relies on interns to do great work, and it's also making future leaders out of them. They get to see the process firsthand. So with that, there being no further business to come before you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention today. Let's go make it a good day. This committee is adjourned.